Hello and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool, and today we are speaking about building up communities by providing psychosocial support for communities by communities. After the break, we are going to be speaking to Valdi van Reenen, who is the founder of the Violence Prevention Agency, alongside two participants in their course called Learning for Change, and who are now providing psychosocial services to schools and at the police stations in Retreat and Mitchells Plain. But before that, we are going to play a short video from the Violence Prevention Agency to see what they do. Let's have a look.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Davids and I am from Lavendale. I'm 28 years old and I've started the journey in regards to the Violence Prevention Agency course. So I started off with Auntie Valdi and a whole team of other ladies, which is a total of 50 plus people if I'm not mistaken. But sharing the experiences and the journey regarding this whole program, it opened and broadened my horizons where I can actually help my community as well. I would also like to say thank you to Lotto for sponsoring VPA, for assisting us where funding is concerned, and also giving the extra mile to the next person that is not privileged enough to do the course specifically. I was chosen amongst all the other ladies, and it's a great privilege to stand here today to know that I am able to learn more and even broaden my horizons on an extra basis as well. The course initially for Violence Prevention Agency is to assist with the mental capacity of an emergency and disaster case, or if both, to assist where we can actually see what we can do if there is no other alternative help for the people, that is for the community that is. And then also, the last thing that I would like to touch base is, I would like to say thank you to all the ladies that assisted and been part of this whole journey with me, because without them, I wouldn't have been here today where I am. Learning more, understanding more, and putting into action as well makes it a bit easier in life, whereby we can show the next person this is not the only thing that you are only knowing. We can help the next and understand the next so that we can help and see where we are in order to move forward. And then also, personally from my perspective in regarding to the course itself, the Violence Prevention Agency course itself, part 1 and part 2, I've learned a lot with a greater spectrum whereby I did not know all these things. I did not understand these things, even though it happened to me in the past as well, certain situations, and I did not know how to prevent it. All that I wanted to do is just get out of the situation, forget about it. But coming to the part of learning what I've learned thus far, it helps me mentally, even spiritually, and emotionally. It helps me socio-economically. It helps me see where I can put my foot first, that is, and also help inside my household, not just in the community, if any other situations arise. So from my end, I would like to say thank you to everybody for assisting me. Also, you should not give up, because that is the main thing that I'm trying not to do. If we ever try and give up, always look for the best in the next day, or even at that given time, because you never know when good is going to come, even if the situation is bad.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about building up communities through providing mental health services. And with me in studio is Valdi van Reenen, who is the founder of the Violence Prevention Agency, and Avela Magagazi, who went through the E-Academy process provided by the Violence Prevention Agency that we are going to speak about now, and is providing some of these services in her community, which is Retreat in Cape Town. Welcome, Valdi and Avela.
Thank you.
So I am so happy to be having this conversation. We have a crisis of mental health and violence in our communities, and Valdi, the Violence Prevention Agency, launched Learning for Change with the aim of bringing people in the community in to become part of the solution. So I want you to speak a little bit about what are the challenges that we are finding in our communities.
I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that the country has over 300,000 MPOs. And we register, and that's it. There's no capacity building for organizations, or there's very little of it. And very often, community-based organizations, once they are registered, they just move on to work. We realized that the capacity of our volunteers, and we move away from the word volunteers. We call our volunteers frontline workers because that is who they are. And very often there's no capacity building for them, particularly in mental health and psychosocial services and support. And yet, many of our organizations do psychosocial support services, but they don't give a name to it. Very often our people help with calming a situation in the community, but they didn't realize that what they were doing was the founding of PFA. And so for us, it's very important, if we want to disrupt violence, if we want to prevent this elephant called violence, how do we eat this elephant? How do we bite it so that we can move into violence prevention and so that we can counter the normalization of violence? So in the Learning for Change program, we focus purely on building the capacity of organizations and their frontline workers to provide basic mental health and psychosocial support to our communities.
I mean, that's really brilliant. I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the organizations and the NPOs that are registered in NPOs or non-profit organizations that work within communities. And Avela, so I want to ask you, so you are the founder of Avela Academy and Sport Entertainment, and this isn't the type of organization that we would perceive to be providing mental health services, right? And so there's lots of organizations that are focusing on sport, that are focusing on education, that are focusing on, health services. But as Valdi is saying, regardless of what sort of your core service is, there's an underlying service of psychosocial support that you provide just by nature of being in the nonprofit sector and by working with people who have challenges, right? People come to nonprofits when they have challenges. I want to ask, in your experience, both before you joined the academy, was that the case that you were having to provide sort of extra services to people who were struggling? And then, going through this process, has it helped you to, I think, better provide these types of services in addition to what you're already doing?
Okay. The training was helpful to me because I always wanted to help. And as an organization that we're working with kids, Avela Academy, it's about sport and education. So when it comes to psychosocial side, we didn't have a person to say, okay, this child can go to this. So after 4 members was trained, now we are saying, okay, we do have a first aid responders in our organization. On that, the training was very helpful. Even in the school that I'm working, there was no PIFA. But now, because I'm there, it's gonna be a huge difference. And remember, we're working with kids, with youth, especially in high schools, it's youth. So it's difficult. They really need someone who's gonna help them.
Can I ask you, Avela, what types of challenges do you find, working in the schools, working closely with children, and we're talking also about psychosocial needs and mental health. What kind of challenges do you find the children are facing these days?
Okay, every day there's cases. There's a lot of cases, like every day. Because in high school, kids always fight. They have background challenges. They're coming from different homes, you understand? So now, when they get to the school, they have that anger issue from home. They're bringing it at the school. So it's like every day there's cases. There's a lot of cases.
Valdi, I want to come to you. Thank you, Avela. I want to come to you and just ask you, South Africa, we live in a violent society. South Africa is known to be one of the most violent countries. We have some of the highest rates of gender-based violence. And Avela is talking about kids coming into school and bringing a lot of that anger, and that anger is manifesting in violent behavior. And so, can you speak a bit about the link between violence, mental health, and behavior?
I think when we look at violence and crime, not all forms of violence is recognized as crime. So we talk about violence and crime. But very often in our schools, although we have in the Western Cape with WCED, we have safer schools. Although we have access to social workers, we have too many schools for those directorates to station social workers at the schools. So you'll find a social worker having to support maybe 22 schools. And therefore, you will not find a social worker at a site unless it was planned for them to be there. When a emergency situation happens. So it's interval, and that's when the fighting begins in the playground, and the fightings go viral because people take photos. But there's nobody to support the person who initiated the fight, the bystanders, and the actual survivor of that fight.
And you know what I'm also thinking? You're mentioning people taking photos and videos and these things going viral. And so now there's a larger pool of victims because now it's the families of those children. And we know on the threads when those videos go onto Facebook, the types of things that people say, which is also extremely violent. The things that adults say about what should be done to these children.
Yeah.
And so there's this outpouring, I think, with this ripple effect coming out now that we haven't seen before. Before we could contain it. Now we need a lot more support. Valdi, I just want to ask you, you were a teacher.
Yes.
And so you are speaking about not being able to have a social worker stationed at the school. I would think that a lot of those psychosocial challenges would fall onto teachers automatically, whether they train for it or not. Can you just tell us a little bit about that experience? So we don't have someone stationed there. We've got children who come, who have lots of and it doesn't necessarily need to be violence at home. It could be hunger, poverty. For some children, there's bullying also at the schools, but for some children, even not being able to have the clothes that everybody else is, not being able to afford those things. So there's lots of challenges our kids are facing. What does that look like when you don't have someone at the school stationed there to address psychosocial needs?
I think it's one of our biggest problems in the school. That our teachers are not able to teach a 45-minute period. You're spending your first 10 to 15 minutes just calming people down. And you're then looking at how you can engage with them. So I would often ask my grade 11s, so what's up? What happened? It gives me an idea of where they are at. And now, when I teach, I had to learn the process of making my teaching material accessible to their experiences for them to understand more. So 9/10 of the period is just spent in giving life skills, in equipping that learner to put aside what was happening at home, what is happening in the community, to concentrate on the lesson. I saw, when I left teaching, became a curriculum advisor within WCED, I saw the differences between our schools who were located in communities with high levels of violence and our schools who were not, who were perhaps more privileged, more resourced. I saw that difference. I personally couldn't cope with that because we are so content driven in our education system. We don't teach empathy. Yet empathy is key to teaching in Finland, in many countries. At the primary school level in Finland, nobody gets homework. You've got to do an act of kindness. But our children don't live in communities where kindness is necessarily displayed. It's foreign to them. It's about scurrying for my food, scurrying for my place in the community, scurrying to survive as a young boy or young girl. And that brings on, that sets the trauma. I think one of our challenges is that mental health and psychosocial disabilities are not diagnosed necessarily in our country, particularly when it comes to PTSD.
And particularly in these communities, the less resourced communities.
That's right. So you are coming in, when we go right back to the pregnancy and the birth of that child is born with toxic stress because the mother is living in a community where there's shooting every day, where there's robbery every day, where the neighbor is screaming because she's been beaten by her partner. The learner couldn't sleep. The learner must sit in the class and do maths. But my mind is not on the maths class. My mind is not on the history class. My mind is on what happened last night. And so these are the challenges that our teachers are facing. Where violence has been normalized. Oh, it's just another child who's been raped. Oh, it's just another murder. And then when we come home as teachers and we are aggressive in our homes, we don't know why. But we've been triggered by the stories of our learners. So it's very hard for teachers. And if you don't have that background, you know, I was fortunate over the years to gain that background in trauma and the connection between violence and trauma and how it impacts on people and how it impacts on learners. I founded the organization on the words of a child in 2019 when we had the People's Commission into child murders. And this was after the former Premier, Alan Zille, refused to give us a commission into the child murders. Child murders remains high in this country. And therefore there is a need for us to put psychological first aid responders in our schools.
Can I ask you, Valdi, I want to ask about the psychological first aid, and I wanted to bring in, before we speak more there, because I wanted to bring in, this training is framed as psychological first aid. It was a new term for me to hear, and so I just wanted to ask you to expand on that before we go further in terms of, what are the choose.
Yeah. Psychological first aid training as a concept has its origins already in the 50s. But it was not until 9/11 when researchers and academics began to see the worth of psychological first aid. What emerged out of the 9/11 was people from all walks of life just coming to support. None of them were necessarily psychologists or social workers or psychologists. Yet they were able to support the victims of 9/11. And out of that rose a number of models within America, within the European communities. What they would do in an American situation is apply psychological first aid when they experience the mass shootings in schools. You'll remember the Boston Marathon. You'll remember Hurricane Katrina. This is when they would use it, because in their schools they have the mental health capacity already. So in a South African context, we don't have the resources. We don't do PFA as a response to a disaster.
And I want to say that, when we look at the levels of crime here, when we look at the levels of shootings, you're talking about child murders, we're talking about, contained big events. I mean, these are big events, 9/11, the Boston Marathon, but we have these mini big events almost daily. We have to go to a break soon, so before, Avela, before you have to go, I wanted to ask you, and so, Valdi is talking about these events. Is there a knock-on effect when there is a big event at the school, like a child murder? I'm just thinking, are the kids at the school sort of mass affected also? Do you see that there's an effect when something big happens in the community?
Okay, when there's an event, they do behave. They do behave. It happens only when it's interval. They know it's only them outside. The teachers are inside. But when there's an event, they always behave because they know that everyone is outside. The teachers are there. So, the kids are very clever. They will never do something if they see that you will see them. Because even when they bully other kids, they don't bully other kids in front of the teachers or in front of anyone. They will always get a way to do whatever they want to do.
I see. And so there's a matter of, and I remember that. I think we all remember that. We're not going to do it sort of in front of everyone. And you find that they are affected by the violence also that they experience. I think I'm just seeing what are some of the behaviors, or some of the behaviors of fighting. Do you find there are other behaviors like not fighting? Do you see sometimes really sad children, really depressed children?
They are, and remember, in our community we are a racial mix.
Yes.
So there's gangsters, and it happens that some of them, they've said stories. They have parents who are using drugs, yet they want to be at school. How are they going to cope? Even when you want to support a child that have a background like that, you always think, how I'm going to speak with this child? What I can say, because the parents are using drugs, the child coming to school with empty stomach. Now how the child is going to concentrate in class? So what support can I give to this child? You're also confused. And you end up now feeling sad, feeling the pain that the child is feeling. That's why we also get a support. As PFAS, we also get a support from our mentor. Because once you get that type of a child, it affects you.
And I think that's a very important thing to say, in terms of, Valdi, what you were talking about, you know, in terms of support, you register organization, you're providing these psychosocial needs. And again, coming back to, I think we can circle back to teachers, you know, and the vicarious trauma that they get through the stories that they are given. And in some instances where you're talking about, you know, parents are using drugs or the home life is disruptive, we can't really call those parents in,
And
you know, so that strategy
some
is not
kids, they were
working.
raped and they didn't even tell their parents.
Sure.
Now they come to you and you think, how am I going to handle this? It's too much for me, even.
Thank you, Avela. And Valdi, we need to take a short break, and we are saying goodbye to Avela now because she has to leave, but we will continue the conversation with Valdi after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about building up communities from within. And with us in studio is Valdi van Reenen from the Violence Prevention Agency, who recently launched an e-learning academy called Learning for Change, and was to provide psychosocial training to organizations in the community. And we are now also joined by Denise Deelman, who is the founder of the New Ambition Youth and Community Development Organization, and works in Mitchell's Plain. Denise went through the program and is now providing psychosocial support or psychological first aid, as Valdi called it in our first, before the break. Welcome, Denise. Okay, so we're going to continue the conversation. So before the break, we were talking about what is psychological first aid. We spoke about some of the participants in the e-learning academy, Valdi, I think, that were placed in schools. And Denise, you work within the schools, but also within SAPS. So you also deal with victims of crime. Yes. And so I just want to come to you for some context here. We spoke a lot about children and violence and crime and sort of that effect on the mental health. And I want to speak from a community perspective and also dealing with victims of crime. I'm sure you see a lot of gender-based violence crimes if you sort of stationed at SAPS. One of the the mental health challenges that you come across and the type of psychosocial support that is needed.
Okay. If I can start in my community, you get women that are abused. They go to court, but they don't understand how the protection order works. So now they call the police and they say, I went to court, I have a court order, my husband is still beating me. So what I found out in the time, because they don't know how the process works. When the policeman came, at first it was, they must go to the police station to go make a case. It was a few years ago, they couldn't act the van or get the policeman in to make a case at the house. They had to go to the police station, but it has changed now. So what I've seen is that most of the women going through this abuse either stop going to the police station or stop going for protection orders, because for them is that I went for a protection order and the police didn't help me. But what I didn't understand was they had to go to the police station to make a case so that the police can come and arrest, I will not say the perpetrator, but the abuser. So women going through that, your child is also going through that. So now what we have is that the husband that abused the woman also abused the child. Or the child might not be abused by the father, but it goes through the same abuse that the mother is going through at the house.
Through watching that domestic violence. Okay, we had fathers in our community selling like this one father sold his 11-year-old daughter for tip. And the mother did nothing because every time when she opens her mouth, she was beat up. And some of the children came to me to say what was the situation. I got SAPS involved, and that mother and the child was helped. The mother was so traumatized that she couldn't even speak when the police, when she had to make a case, because she was too traumatized, and the fact that the child had to go through that, she blamed herself. So now she's in a place where she can't even help her own child. So now besides the fact that we have mothers that's going through abuse, we have girls being raped, gang raped.
Now the mothers are forced to keep quiet. The parents are forced to keep quiet because they are afraid to lose their lives. So what I've decided is I need help. I saw mothers whose children has been gunned down before them. For counseling. There's no real counseling for them. Then before Valdi became the psychosocial support teacher, she was Valdi worked with
Trauma center.
trauma center.
yes.
I remembered Valdi from the trauma center because we worked on cases like Stasha Arends. I worked with the Mitchell's Plain Crisis Forum. We went to look for missing children. The Courtney Peters case, I was there.
And so Denise, I want to ask you, so, you know, prior to joining the e-learning academy and you're doing this work, and these are like, you know, these are hectically traumatic cases that you're speaking about, and the types of violence that you're speaking about, was there a lack of psychosocial? So even if the justice, because I'm always interested, even though the justice process is going, let's say someone's arrested, where does it leave? You know, the people are traumatized. Was there any psychosocial support available?
None.
Ongoing psychosocial support?
There's none.
Yeah.
That's why I phoned Valdi. I said, listen here, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. The people in the community, they need help. Can't you train, or can't you give our people trauma support training? Because we need our community to assist our community. And that is why I took 10 people to Valdi to be trained as PVAs, you know, in order for us to assist our communities. The same with the people that comes to the police station. Yes, we assist them. They leave there. We refer them to other organizations. But sometimes the women don't go back because you don't have money to go maybe to FAMSA or whatever. You walk out of Tafelsig to the police station to get help. I don't think you're not going to walk back again from Tafelsig to Mitchell's Plain to get help or to be assisted. So now I said, listen, let's start something in our community, you know, because we can be effective in our community. We had a case 2-3 weeks ago where 2 boys was gunned down in the street, where we could assist with the training that Valdi has given us. We could have assisted the family immediately on the scene. You know, so for me, this violence prevention was one of the best trainings that we had, because we can assist our community immediately. We are the first responders on the scene. So yes.
Thank you, Denise. I mean, you've given us sort of a great context about what our communities are dealing with. Children, adults, families, in the community as a whole. Valdi, you know, one of the, when we think about the Learning Academy, which is called Learning for Change, and the tagline is become part of the solution. And so, what Denise brought up especially is when we look at the psychosocial services that are available, often people need to go out of their communities, and cost is a huge factor. Cost is already a factor if you go into the justice system. We know people need to attend court cases. Sometimes they can't because they don't have taxi fare. And so psychosocial support becomes almost a luxury. So I wanted to ask you, before the break, we were talking about psychological first aid. We were talking about what it is. I wanted to ask you, so in the context of the examples that Denise was giving us, what does psychological first aid look like? And I'm asking sort of what's happening to the body and the nervous system in the face of something so huge, and how does the psychological first aid help? In which it doesn't take away what's happened, but how does it help to calm the person?
I think one of the things, you know, when we left off, we were speaking about the American experience.
Yes.
But that is not necessarily the South African experience. I only know of Jelly Bean's organization who's using one of the models. They're using the World Health Organization's model of PFA. Look, listen, and link. Very simple. And they're using it to work with children. There are 4 other models that we've taken Denise and Avela through. And we've taken them through to understand that these are models that work in an American setup for a response action disaster. But in our situation, how do we adapt a European style of PFA to put a South African context, where we are talking about intergenerational trauma? We are talking about political systems that have left us wounded, colonialism, apartheid, and neo-apartheid, neo-colonialism, the new continuities of intergenerational trauma
And I think Avela was also
political
talking about,
systems.
you know, racism still in every day that
Exactly.
carries, you know, the intergenerational carrying over of that we're seeing in our schools as well. So we've got a lot.
Exactly, and so for BPA, for Violence Prevention Agency, we are saying, how do we prevent violence? How do we begin to say, but violence prevention starts with you, the individual? How do we emancipate ourselves from the violence that we are experiencing in our country? And how do we move from the often government must? How do we begin to say, what are the skills that we have that we can use? And I found it very profound in the training when people would say, "Maar ons doen dit. We're doing this already." And then I can say to them, okay, but are you doing that within this treatment framework? Are you doing that? Oh, nee, that's new for me. So building the capacity of our organizations is a #1 priority, because when we have more frontline workers who can serve as psychological first aid responders, nowhere in the world do you need to have a qualification to be a psychological first aider or a psychological first aider responder. Now this makes it adaptable and accessible in our communities. I came across a professor from one of the universities in America, and he spoke about 2 types of psychological first aid. And what thrilled me was his take on community-based PFA, which I think is more the context in which our organizations are working. When our frontliners come to the BPA e-learning academy, they can't be lone rangers. In other words, they can't be working on their own. They must be attached to an organization. So what we are doing is we're partnering between government, and it could be SAPS, it could be the Department of Health, and it could be the Department of Education. We are partnering with government, we are partnering with community organizations to bring about a collective response to the lack of mental health resources in our community. So when Avela, for example, speaks about sports, we don't recognize that the sports is an avenue for PFA to happen, but it is. Because as the sport coach, you become the PFA. You become the responder, because that child is speaking to you about what's happening to. So you know, the psychosocial support services is a very broad cluster of interventions that can happen. What we are advocating is that we have special safe places, which we call hubs. And these hubs, which we locate either at the police station through their victim-friendly room or in our schools, we are hoping to move back into health clinics. These are the hubs where we will locate our trained frontline workers who get a theoretical course 1 on violence and violence prevention strategies. In course 2, we take them through the models, the European models for PFA. We talk about community-based PFA, and we talk about how we as a cohort together can begin to look at how do we develop a PFA model that is conducive to a South African context, and even a continental continent. We see it happening in Nigeria. We see a very different form of PFA. We see it happening in Kenya. And so how do we begin to develop a PFA model that is South African based, that takes into our situation? Gerald Jacobs, the professor, speaks about community based, and that is where we are going for. We are going for ensuring that we can put our PFAS into primary schools, which is a bit more safer than just working in the community. It gives our people a safe space, and it gives the children a safe space to come into the PIP.
Now, this is also very interesting because one of the things that people say when we bring programs from other countries, and I love that you're saying it's adaptable, and it needs to be adaptable, because often they're very rigid about just what they call transplanting this program from here, but it doesn't speak to the local context. We don't have a lot of time left. So, Denise, I just wanted to ask you though, so you've been through the academy, you said earlier, this has helped you in your work. And I just wanted to ask, as an example of the response to the program and how it's working in communities, how has it helped you? How has it changed the way you deal with these cases, and how has it helped you?
Okay, for me, I have a broader understanding of what violence is, because you think that violence is just a slap and a kick, but there is different forms of violence. And now that I have that understanding, I even know how to treat even the gang leader in a better way. I don't just see him as that gang leader, because I have now a way in approaching him and to ask him, listen, can't we do this thing this way? Or I will go to, like for instance, we had children throwing each other with stones. I called in both groups, but I called in SAPS also, the sector command of our area, and then I called the groups in and I let the policemen speak to them in terms of what is the consequences of their actions. And then they spoke to both groups, and the stone throwing stopped. So for me, by doing this VPA, the violent prevention, taught me how to deal with children even in a better way, to come back to the schools also. We also have that program at the school where we see the children are selling the strongbow bombies, the vodka bombies, and and they're selling dacha in school. So for intervention, I spoke to the principal, said, can't we just do an awareness to make the children aware of the consequences that they will face if they keep on following this action. So now we will not finger point and say you, but we take different steps in approaching even that child that is a problem. Because sometimes that child that is a problem, what I find out, can't read and write. So now he disrupts the whole class. And now the teachers label him. They chuck him out of the class. He plays outside. He's running around. He's not part of whatever is going on. And then
I'm so sorry to cut you, Denise, but we are out of time. I like what you're saying, because often we don't think about, it's looking at taking a different take. So not dealing with violence, with more violence, because sometimes discipline is also violence, or is violence. You know, the way we think about discipline, it's also violence, like chucking them out or hitting them or threatening them, but rather taking a more holistic approach that takes into account the person's behavior, violent behavior within the context of his whole situation. So I want to thank you so much for joining us and for sharing with us. We're going to come back. Denise is leaving us now, but actually, Valdi, I want to come back with you to just talk a little bit about behavior change before we go. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we have speaking about building up communities through providing psychosocial support in those communities. And with me still is Valdi van Reenen, who is the founder of the Violence Prevention Agency, who have just launched an e-learning academy called Learning for Change, and that is training organizations with psychosocial services to be able to be part of the solution. So Valdi, we've had a long conversation now. We're speaking about psychological first aid, providing counseling in schools or within communities to help not contain, but sort of help people with the extent of violence. We've spoken about the extent of that violence and what is happening in our communities. Violence is part of our behavior in some way, or anger is, or negative emotions. All of us are violent in some way, shape, or form, even if we're shouting at somebody. How can we think about preventing? What do you mean when you say preventing violence, and that starts with the individual?
Firstly, when we look at violence as behavior, behaviors can be changed. When we look at violence, violence is predictable. We can predict when there's going to be a gang warfare. Because if we have had the assassination, and this has happened recently in the retreat area, of a popular gang leader, we know there'll be a gang war. Over the years, I was taught by community what to look for when I drive in. How do you drive into a community where you know there's a gang war? So if you can begin to predict, and you can begin to see the signs, who's on the roof, who's sitting at the door, normally girls sitting at the door on their mobile. You think they're playing games. They're not playing games. They're sending intelligence to the gangs. But all those signs you see, and if you can see those signs, then you can prevent violence. Because you can then look at, how do I deal with this elephant? What was fascinating for me is to work with drug addicts who then perpetrate violence. But when you start hearing their story, they're getting their drug counseling, but they're also getting some support, some psychosocial support. And when you hear their story, the one case where the boy said, my pa was dood, my ma aan 'n berg, mother's got another boyfriend, but this boyfriend hits her. And I couldn't deal with it anymore. And I wanted to take that knife and I wanted to stab him. And something said, look out, walk out, go to the shop. I stood at the shop. And that way is where I was groomed. And that is where I got my free drugs. And after that, I had to become a drug peddler in order to get my fix. And that's how I became a drug addict. When we come in and we tell them, so what happened? Tell us your story. And we hear, and we say, you've done the drugs as a coping mechanism for you. Although the drugs is a maladaptive coping mechanism, that is what you needed at that time to survive.
And so there's almost what is coming through also is no judgment, and the power of story and the healing of listening to each other's story at the baseline of what the psychological first aid and the psychosocial needs are. Valdi, I want to start. We have probably 1.5 minutes left. Is there a message To anyone out there, we know a lot of people sitting out there are affected by the violence and can relate directly to a lot of the things that you are saying.
No one organization can bring about violence prevention. We need partnerships. We need collective working together. We must stop arguing with each other over petty stuff. Within civil society, we sometimes become the mafia. Where the biggest organizations can overpower our community-based organizations. But yet our community-based organizations are the people working on the ground. They are the people working on the ground, and they are the people that need capacity. We don't want to see our organizations only doing social protests, food cans. It's important, but they have other skills, other expertise, other capacity that can be given to them that can heighten the level,
as we've seen,
of our work.
Thank you very much, Valdi. Thank you for coming onto the show, for sharing, for doing this work, and also for teaching us a lot, especially about the psychological first aid. I found it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And that is all we have for today. I want to thank you so much for joining us from your homes. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we have speaking about building up communities through providing psychosocial support in those communities. And with me still is Valdi van Reenen, who is the founder of the Violence Prevention Agency, who have just launched an e-learning academy called Learning for Change, and that is training organizations with psychosocial services to be able to be part of the solution. So Valdi, we've had a long conversation now. We're speaking about psychological first aid, providing counseling in schools or within communities to help not contain, but sort of help people with the extent of violence. We've spoken about the extent of that violence and what is happening in our communities. Violence is part of our behavior in some way, or anger is, or negative emotions. All of us are violent in some way, shape, or form, even if we're shouting at somebody. How can we think about preventing? What do you mean when you say preventing violence, and that starts with the individual?
Firstly, when we look at violence as behavior, behaviors can be changed. When we look at violence, violence is predictable. We can predict when there's going to be a gang warfare. Because if we have had the assassination, and this has happened recently in the retreat area, of a popular gang leader, we know there'll be a gang war. Over the years, I was taught by community what to look for when I drive in. How do you drive into a community where you know there's a gang war? So if you can begin to predict, and you can begin to see the signs, who's on the roof, who's sitting at the door, normally girls sitting at the door on their mobile. You think they're playing games. They're not playing games. They're sending intelligence to the gangs. But all those signs you see, and if you can see those signs, then you can prevent violence. Because you can then look at, how do I deal with this elephant? What was fascinating for me is to work with drug addicts who then perpetrate violence. But when you start hearing their story, they're getting their drug counseling, but they're also getting some support, some psychosocial support. And when you hear their story, the one case where the boy said, my pa was dood, my ma aan 'n burg, mother's got another boyfriend, But this boyfriend hits her. And I couldn't deal with it anymore. And I wanted to take that knife and I wanted to stab him. And something said, look out, walk out, go to the shop. I stood at the shop. And that way is where I was groomed. And that is where I got my free drugs. And after that, I had to become a drug peddler in order to get my fix. And that's how I became a drug addict. When we come in and we tell them, so what happened? Tell us your story. And we hear, and we say, you've done the drugs as a coping mechanism for you. Although the drugs is a maladaptive coping mechanism, that is what you needed at that time to survive.
And so there's almost what is coming through also is no judgment and the power of story and the healing of listening to each other's story at the baseline of what the psychological first aid and the psychosocial needs are. Valdi, I want to stop. We have probably 1.5 minutes left. Is there a message to anyone out there? We know a lot of people sitting out there are affected by the violence and can relate directly to a lot of the things that you are saying.
No one organization can bring about violence prevention. We need partnerships. We need collective working together. We must stop arguing with each other over petty stuff. Within civil society, we sometimes become the mafia. Where the biggest organizations can overpower our community-based organizations. But yet our community-based organizations are the people working on the ground. They are the people working on the ground, and they are the people that need capacity. We don't want to see our organizations only doing social protests, food cans. It's important, but they have other skills, other expertise, other capacity that can be given to them that can heighten the level
as we've seen
of our work.
Thank you very much, Valdi. Thank you for coming onto the show, for sharing, for doing this work, and also for teaching us a lot, especially about the psychological first aid. I found it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And that is all we have for today. I want to thank you so much for joining us from your homes. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye.